So, okay, let's go first into to Friedman's text here. Again, remember that the virtue of highly valued assumptions is not grounded in their descriptive accuracy, well, we've heard that many times, but in their analytic relevance. And analytic relevance implies not being realistic, according to Friedman. Well, this is his theory. And most people say, I don't understand a bit what you are talking about. By the way, the converse of the proposition does not hold, of course, says Friedman. So it's the case that the really good assumptions are not descriptively true, but analytically relevant. And he says explicitly that the converse does not hold. Explicitly, he says, not every false assumption is analytically relevant. Right? Only if you pick out the analytically relevant and observe them, you say, oh, they're descriptively false. But not every descriptively false bullshit is analytically relevant. He says it explicitly. Then read Mäki 2009b 9b on page 95, in which he just claims that. I don't understand that. But anyway, he does it. Okay. So, and the question is then, why does the analytic relevance of an assumption, in quotes, imply it's not being descriptively accurate? We did have some clues already, meaning, by abstraction, idealization, substitution, blah, blah, blah. But we get a much, much better answer in this section for economics, because in F53, Friedman specifies the false assumptions that occur in economic theory by saying these assumptions contain ideal types. And the term ideal type occurs 6 times in F53 on 3 pages. Okay, who has heard the term ideal types before? You have heard it? Okay, what did you do? Sociology class? Political science. Yes, they use it. You heard it?
Yeah, authority. So ideal types of authority.
Yes, I'm coming to that. Yeah, anyway, very good. So this is very strange. Well, it's not strange that in 2022, economic students usually never heard of ideal types. And that was very different some decades ago. And you will see that in a moment. Now, here is what Friedman says in that respect. The confusion between descriptive accuracy and analytic relevance has led to misunderstanding of economic theory. This is what I quoted. Ideal types in the abstract model developed by economic theorists have been regarded as strictly descriptive categories intended to correspond directly and fully to entities in the real world, independently of the purpose for which the model is being used. So there are these ideal types, whatever they are, and then Friedman says, look, people have thought they are just representations of reality and they correspond directly to the real world, independently of the purpose. So what I said here, and this is of course what Friedman denies. He says, no, it's not independent of the purpose of the model. And this is really one of the most important things you can take away from Friedman. If you use models, be careful. The model is devised for a particular class of situations, and it may be utterly false and unusable outside of these situations. We come back to that. Okay. So ideal types, in fact, what he says here, ideal types are in the abstract model by economic theories, and they, of course, then do not correspond directly to entities in the real world, and they are not independent of the purpose for which the model is used. This is, of course, indirectly following from this. Now, let's see what ideal types are. They are an influential element of Max Weber's sociology. Again, Max Weber, Emil Durkheim, and Karl Marx are the founders of sociology. Sociology was really began in the mid-19th century, and then was developed at the end of the 19th century. A discipline of sociology was fully developed. And Max Weber is one of them, and he used these ideal types in his sociology, but also he was also an economist. I also come back to that. So he used it also in economic analysis. And before coming to Friedman's examples, let us look at an illustration of ideal types by Weber himself. I mean, how he introduces them. I find this is a wonderful piece They're of meta-sociology, what Weber writes about ideal types, and this is exactly that you were referring to in a paper from 1902. I think it was posthumously published, The Three Types of Legitimate Rule, or Authority, it's translated. And in originally it's die drei reinen Typen der legitimen Herrschaft. And Herrschaft in German is very badly translatable into English. So it's just types of rule or authority. And there in that paper, Weber claims that there are exactly three pure types of legitimate rule or authority, and that is a rule authority that is stabilized through some kind of legitimation. So you have a certain state or whatever it is, right? And there is some rule authority, and that is stabilized by some kind of legitimation. And there Weber says you can distinguish in history exactly three ideal types, how this is in the purest form, right? Each is connected with fundamentally different sociological administrative structures. So it depends how such a nation or whatever it is, or people or country, how it works concerning the administrative structure, depending on the kind of legitimate rule, the kind of legitimate rule. And they are legal authority, that's purely conventional rules, and that's connected with bureaucracy. Legal authority, that's the democracies. Right? The legal authority, that power of the parliament, that decides what the laws are, and they are purely conventional. They are not committed to anything, while they are to constitution, but also the constitution can be changed, and it's just the authority of our parliaments that decide what the laws are. We have to obey them. And then there is traditional authority, so patriarchy, so that you have in monarchies, for instance, well, you have this rule, and it's patriarchic, typically traditional authority, and you have charismatic authority, where you have a leader that somehow comes to power. So, for instance, Hitler would be a case like that. Or other countries where you have charismatic authorities. And this is at least Weber's description of these three different types. And the basic idea of these introduction of these different, what he calls ideal types, is that these three types exhaust all pure types of legitimate rule. So he says, look, we have different forms of that legitimate rule, but we can distinguish three types that are really independent of each other, and they are the pure forms, right? And we never have these pure forms in reality, and they are mutually exclusive. So it can't be, it's a patriarchy and another one, so that they are mutually exclusive, but the real cases of legitimate rule are mixtures of the ideal types. So a mixture is something else than the independence of the ideal types themselves, right? The ideal case is pure, and there you have then, for instance, only legal authority and nothing else of the other things. But in reality, you may have mixtures, right? So if you look at Great Britain, it had aspects of the patriarchic system and, of course, democratic system. So we find that in reality, mixtures, real cases of legitimate rule are mixtures of the ideal types. That's the idea. So Friedman uses that where he speaks about, I think, in that context, he also speaks about ideal types, and he takes them from the famous economist Marshall, whom he values very highly. Namely, he has two ideal types: perfect competition in a market, perfect competition with atomistically competitive firm is one ideal type, and the other one is a perfect monopoly with a monopolistic firm. Right? So these are ideal types, how a market with firms there can work, ideally. Right? Ideally not meaning that's the best thing, but just as an abstraction, right? Perfect competition versus perfect monopoly. And now I give you my reconstruction of that, and I think it's helpful. One referee of the paper I now published did not find that helpful. Well, find out whether you find it helpful. I described that in the following way, that ideal types are the basic vectors in a vector space that contains the pertinent real phenomena. So I guess you are familiar with vector spaces. If not, you're getting the basics in a moment. So we have some set of empirical phenomena. So the behavior of firms in a certain market, in a certain politically given situation. So we have a certain set of empirical phenomena. and it's analyzed in a vector space, and that means the following. I put that in a vector space, right? And the vector space is spanned, as mathematicians speak, by two ideal types. So the vector space is ideal type 1 and ideal type 2. They're perpendicular because they are absolutely independent of each other. And then a real phenomenon is analyzed, a real type is analyzed in terms of the two ideal types in the following sense, that you can say then the real type is, as he says, a mixture of the ideal types. Well, they have different weight, and that can be nicely expressed by scalar factors alpha and beta. So the real type is alpha times ideal type 1 and beta times ideal type 2. Right? This is the idea of describing what ideal types are, their independence, perpendicularity, and then the real types are mixtures, and that can be described in this way as an element in the vector space. Right? The analysis corresponds well, I think, with Friedman's two components of economic models, when he says in the beginning and also later, economic models are a set of ideal types. F53 calls them the abstract model, and that's and the language component of a theory is a set of tautologies. I explained to you already, tautologies in the language of the 50s in America is really definitions. And they are now, we can say, we didn't understand that when he wrote that in the beginning, but of course he had in the back of his mind long before saying it, ideal types. So what he says is you start in economic theory, in this model, in Friedman's model, a set of ideal types by which you intend to analyze a situation. So the cigarette industry, in the war, before the war, and then you have taxes or constraints or whatever. And these are the definition of the ideal types. And then the rules how to analyze real types in terms of one of the ideal types, right? Geared by the particular problem of hand. So in the case of the cigarette industry, he says, well, if you look at the war situation, I think you can understand them as in perfect competition, or in the other case, you can understand them as monopolies, right? It just depends what you're analyzing, right? What influence of which factor you're analyzing. So he says rules how to analyze real types in terms of one of the ideal types, and that means the following, that these as-if explanations are then explanation of a real type in which alpha or beta are contrafactually set to 0, as if the real type reduced to one ideal type. And this is what Friedman says, right? You can analyze a certain situation in the cigarette industry as if there was perfect competition, which I know it isn't. Friedman. I know it isn't. But in some situations, that's a good idealization. And in other situations, you can describe them as if they were monopolistic, right, in a different situation. And that can be represented here by setting these scalar factors to the ideal types to 0 and 1, respectively. Okay, so this is the idea, just getting this idea out of Friedman and from nothing else, and just a little background of Weber, that one knows what he's talking about when he talks about these ideal types. And in physics, by the way, a corresponding case is the law of free fall. You can immediately apply that, although it's never been done, because that is this ideal type stuff was developed for sociology and economics by Weber, and of course not to analyze physics. But if you see that Friedman uses this analogy, one can ask, is that also there appropriate? Of course it is. And the ideal type is a situation with constant gravitational force and no other forces. So you describe the free fall here in reality, many forces and non-constant gravitation. You say, oh, I describe it by one ideal type, and that's the ideal type is free fall in a vacuum. And then you ask, is that a good description? Well, depends how good the predictions are. Yes, they are good for certain situations, namely short falls and heavy bodies, right, comparatively. And then it works. And, well, this is what I said. The ideal type is predictively good enough for those real types in which the distance traveled to the Earth's surface is not too large and the weight of the falling body is not too small. So it's a very bad description for feathers, right? And it's a very bad description for base jumpers, right? It doesn't work for them, right? Parachute, no, even in free fall there, okay? Here you see that the ideal types, fit the case of falsity due to abstraction and idealization better than falsity due to abstraction and substitution. Now I'm connecting back. What he says in section 5 about ideal types, I connect back to the analysis of these falsities. And now you can say, well, where do they fit? Now I think they fit a little better because it seems to be that ideal types are generated by abstraction from real situations and not really with substitution. So if you see these types of legitimate rule, then you have a variety of empirical examples, and then you say, oh, I abstract here, one of this legitimate rule is such and such, or in the economics case, one of the ideal type is perfect competition, and the other one is perfect monopoly, and they are not constructed, but they are or substituted, but they are really abstracted. They seem to fit better, so well, this is what I said, a real-type market situation with some competition may lead to, by abstraction and idealization, to the ideal-type market situation with perfect competition. That's clear in abstraction and idealization. However, from a real-type expert player or manager, one does not really get by abstraction and idealization to the differential equation solving billiard player or the marginal cost and marginal revenue, etc., calculating manager, because this is rather a substitution. So there is a tension now, apparently, that one can say, well, Friedman is using Weber here, but Weber really only fits really the first type, right, of falsities. That is at least the first impression. However, one can also say the respective experts are also ideal types if you abstract from the mechanism that produced their ideality. Right? You may say an ideal billiard player is one that always gets it right according to the laws of physics. And then I can say, okay, this ideal billiard player, I substitute him by a computer program that solves the differential equations, right? So you may also say, of course, this is interpretation here, but it's not absurd, certainly not. But it's quite plausible that you say, okay, yes, it's not really the ideal type exactly in the sense of Weber, because as far as I know the Weberian stuff there, and I've read quite of that stuff well, many years ago already, but I've looked it up again. And he really thinks, as far as I could see, only of abstraction and idealization. But I think it's not illegitimate there that Friedman implicitly then extends this concept also to the cases of substitution. It's fine. So you have the ideal billiard player is the one that would calculate everything perfectly. So it's okay, I think. So, and this is now the summary concerning that. Contrary to the common perception, the false assumptions that Friedman admits for economic theory are of a very, very special kind and not just any sort of falsity. And this is, I showed you in the very, very first quote last time, that people think Friedman is happy with any sort of falsity as long as it gives good predictions. And that's just not there. It's not in Friedman's text. He has very special kinds of falsities, namely these falsities by abstraction and idealization, or abstraction and substitution, and then he specifies further those that I can see as ideal types, as describing ideal types. Right? And the ideal types isolate the most important factors in a certain situation. Right? They are not just dreamed up, but you've got to analyze it and then look, what is the most important factor in a certain situation? So when the falling ball, the most important factor is gravity, and you've got to get that right. If you think the most important factor is friction, you get it wrong. Well, very simple. If you have the feather, then the most important factor is, well, it's gravity plus friction, because without gravity and friction it stays. But with gravity, then. But friction is an important factor because that dominates then after a while, in a sense. Okay. So it's a very, very, very special kind of falsities that Friedman has in mind, descriptively false, because they typically involve only one ideal type, whereas a more adequate description of the phenomenon in question would typically require a linear combination of all ideal types that span the respective vector space of the phenomenon in the language that I introduced by introducing these vector description of the whole thing. And this is the important lesson. This particular ideal type isolates the most important factor of the real type, which is decisive in a particular situation, and possibly irrelevant for the same system in another situation. That's the point. So it really depends on what you want to know, right, about the cigarette industry with Friedman's example. What you want to know, what's the effects of a tax increase, or what's the effect of, I don't know what the other constraint was, right? And then it depends on the situation. The same system, it's the same cigarette industry, right? The same cigarette industry, but with different constraints, exogenous constraints, and then it depends what sort of ideal type you are using. And this is really an important lesson. I mean, all the good economists know that without having read Friedman, because it's, in a sense, obvious. You make a model, and then you think what's important here, and then you have a different situation, and then, of course, not the same things have to be important there. Okay. So for example, a real firm is described. The real firm is the linear combination of a firm in perfect competition and a perfectly monopolistic firm. For some problems, one sets alpha equals to 0, and for others, you set beta to 0. This is what he's saying, and I think I'm only reproducing that and possibly more transparent. Anyway, assumptions in Friedman's sense are thus not statements that claim truth or plausibility. That's the first important thing. Therefore, they are descriptively false. But that's once you've understood it, it's trivial, right? But they are intentionally false statements that isolate one particular factor, an ideal type. This is conjectured to be the most relevant one for the particular problem at hand. Right? This is a conjecture. You don't really know it. It's just, it's a sort of speculation. The same holds for the Homo economicus assumption, man to be selfish and money-grabbing. This is what he refers to here. And here you can also describe that a real human being has both a selfish component and an altruistic human component. And some people may have alpha 1 and beta 0, and others the other way around. And most people are sometimes selfish, sometimes egotistic. Some economic problems with there can be treated by setting beta equal to 0, so selfish treating humans as Homo economicus, which, by the way, I told you once, one theoretician said that applies much better to orang-utans than to human beings, the Homo economicus, so it's Homo orang-utus. Okay. So, all right. So there is one problem. And this is also one referee in one journal said, he speaks about ideal types. That doesn't say anything, right? He's so flimsy, floppy, imprecise in his language. So you exaggerating by bringing Max Weber in here. Doesn't make sense. Well, it did not really convince me. The problem of my reconstruction clearly is Friedman never cites Max Weber in 53, and according to this reconstruction, he plays such a major role. And there is no quote you'd say, that can't be right. Okay? Did Friedman really know of Max Weber's ideal types? Is there any sort of trace? It's no trace, direct trace, of course, in the paper. Now, in 1935-36, Friedman attended a seminar on Max Weber at the University of Chicago, given by economist Frank Knight. And other attendees were Edward Schultz. You probably don't know of him. He's a famous American sociologist, but George Stigler may be a name you've heard, Nobel in economics, so famous economist. And who was Frank Knight? Now, Frank Knight was the first translator of Max Weber into English. Right, so he was the authority in the United States in the 30s, and he was a professor, founder of the Chicago School of Economics, the Chicago Boys, you may have heard it, and he was the first translator of Max Weber into English, the Journal of Economic History in 1927, and the German original in 23, and he was the founder of the Chicago School, so he was really influential. He got completely forgotten after Second World War. And in some of his works, Knight defended economic theory using an ideal type methodology. So this is why he gave that seminar. He said, look, the ideal type methodology of Max Weber is exactly what we need for economics. This is good economics. And he was influential. And then, in addition, Friedman did not only attend the seminar, but he's the co-editor of a collection of Knight's essay published in 1935. This was a collection of essays to his 49th birthday. very funny. You know, people in academia are sometimes funny. I don't know whether that's a kind of humor. Anyway, so collection of essays for Frank Knight. And some of these essays contain very strong Weberian elements. So when you read them, it's really show the appreciation of Knight of Weber. Okay, so we have this connection. It's quite clear that Friedman was somehow familiar. Now imagine he was a grad student, I think, or just a postdoc in 35 when he attended this lecture. He wrote this article in 53. Make the difference, it's 18 years later with the World War in between. And he had read that article, and then, you know, he has that in the back of his mind. And then, so my plausible story is, of course, he had all that Max Weber stuff still there, but he didn't go back then and read and find to make nice quotes of Max Weber, but he just wrote it in there. And it's very natural. And he uses the term, and everyone who knows Max Weber sees the term and says, well, is that in there? And my answer is, yes, it is. So